My name is Tatiana Berger, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to the Frontiers Colloquium Series in Neuroscience for Architecture at the New School of Architecture and Design in San Diego, with the participation of Dr. Harry Francis Mallgrave. We're grateful to ANFA for co-sponsoring this event. Harry Francis Mallgrave is a distinguished professor emeritus from the Illinois Institute of Technology. He received his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and has enjoyed a career as an award-winning scholar, translator, editor, and architect. He has published more than a dozen books on various topics of architectural history and theory. His latest book, From Object to Experience, The New Culture of Design, has recently been released from Bloomsbury Publishers in London. The work of Harry Mallgrave has had a tremendous impact on the New School and has inspired its commitment to human-centered design. It has informed and enriched our curriculum in the design studio, architectural and urban theory, history courses, and in the courses that we offer as part of the certificate program in neuroscience for architecture. Dr. Mallgrave's book, The Architect's Brain, has been a core text in these courses for the past several years. We're very pleased to announce that Dr. Mallgrave will also be joining our Neuroscience for Architecture, Urbanism, and Design Summer Intersession this coming August 12th to 16th here at the New School. This is an executive level course for professionals in architecture, design, and the health sciences. And you can find more information about the summer course on our website. Now it's my honor to welcome Harry Mallgrave. Thank you for joining us, Harry. It is all yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Tatiana. And I want to welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here, and particularly happy that I didn't have to spend 10 hours on a plane to do it. But I think we can do the same thing much more efficiently this way as well. Where I'd like to begin is with this little statement from the Davos conference of 2018, a little more than a year ago, where they talk about the need for a high-quality Baukultur for Europe. It's an interesting sort of statement in that it is unusual. First of all, I'm sure you're aware that the Davos is a city in Switzerland which every year invites hundreds of CEOs, people in politics and other areas to come and listen to a series of lectures, seminars, to have private discussions and discuss the state of the world and the like. So it's somewhat unusual for a conference with that orientation to pick up the topic of architecture. And particularly the way this one was framed, because they talk about the urgent need for a cultured-centered or humanistic view of a culture-centered approach or a humanistic view of the built environment. Because obviously this is something that I think has concerned everyone in the room and myself and others for a number of years. So I just wanted to start by posing the question of what is a holistic culture-centered approach to the built environment? Now, the problem here is that 20th century sociological, anthropological theory had a somewhat different definition of culture than I think the track that the contemporary humanities are tending. They looked at culture as sort of the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate, whereas we're sort of born as organisms with these genetic structures, and we come into the world and become encultured by the system of checks and balances, as it were, that were put up to weave our behavior in certain ways. I think that such a definition is quite obsolete today. And I guess to begin, I'd like to take culture back to the original Latin word cultura, which means to cultivate or to grow something in a soil or in a prepared medium, such as you see with these vials here, because I think it provides it's a much better metaphor for where the idea of culture is trending today. And in architectural terms, it's quite specific. We can refer to culture as the tending of the human organism in its built and social environments. I think by looking at culture in this sense, or looking at architecture effectively as the cultural medium in which our life sort of unfolds, it suggests that we should realign or rethink some of the priorities that we have about design. And in this regard, as I think so many of you in the room know, over the last 2 or 3 decades in particular, the biological and the humanities have provided us with a number of new tools, a number of new insights into how we engage with the environment. And this is on the emotional level, the perceptual level, aesthetically as well as socially. And I think we're beginning to have the tools. We don't have the research yet, but I think we're beginning to have the tools to really look at a way to build a new sort of cultural ethos, which is focused not so much on the object of architectural design, which of course has to be well built and nicely detailed and exquisitely conceived, but as much or if not more focus given to the human experience of what this built environment is. And this is, I'm going to argue that it unfolds on various levels, which I'll get to momentarily. I also just want to throw in the Evan Thompson quotation, the fact that we're not simply knowing minds, brains in a head or brains in bodies, that we are from the very beginning of our existence already encultured human beings, and that the process of enculturation is continually going through a change in a very dynamic process. So there is no, you can't really look at culture as some sort of an outside medium. It really is part of the environmental medium in which we live and thrive, hopefully. I've also just want to add another clarification, because I raised the word aesthetic, and I know it has a particular historical meaning relating to the judgment of an artifact, whether, and of course, to go back to the 18th century, we have the enormous discussion among philosophers and the like on whether beauty was in the object, or whether beauty was in the human mind, or whether it was in the eyes of the beholder, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the original meaning of this word didn't have that judgmental value attached to it. It goes back to, if you go back to the Greek term, it means perception, feeling, sensible cognition. Basically, the very way that we engage the world, not so much on a judgmental level, but on an organismic level. So I'm going to sort of use the term aesthetic more in the sense of perceptual attunement that we have with the world, rather than some sort of a judgment on whether something is beautiful or not, although at the end I will be talking about the idea of beauty. So let's explore a little bit of where I'm coming from, and I just want to go back a little bit in time. If we go back to the first half of, say, the 19th century, we have an architectural culture which looked at the various styles out there as sort of representations of culture. And there were certain requirements for that. You should, tend to build a church in a Gothic style, and build a palace in a Baroque style, or build an art museum in a Renaissance style, because these were the meanings attached to these particular styles. Now, by the mid-1850s, these attachments, as they were already breaking down. And I put in this one example of Henri Labrousse's Bibliothèque de Geneviève in Paris. He actually used a sort of a skeletal Renaissance form for the design of the exterior, but he did it in a way that was actually responding to a passage in the novel of Victor Hugo, on Notre Dame, where Hugo had argued that architecture was dead because we wouldn't have to build another Gothic cathedral because people could read, and therefore they didn't have to look at the cathedral facade to understand the scriptures. what Labrousse did was he had the books stacked up under the window, and then on the outside behind those books, he actually wrote the names of the authors. So we have a very sort of literary or literal, I guess, symbolism of what this building is, which is in fact a library. And this was his solution to what the problem that Victor Hugo had raised earlier. Now, if we move ahead another 70 years or so, we reached the sort of the end of that process, and we have a sort of a different theory of meaning for architecture, where form in itself is going to represent meaning. And of course, Le Corbusier famously used it to the notion that that he was looking for machine-made manufactured technologies and how it would transform architecture. But basically, this was still a representational system where form creates a meaning, which is understood in the sense. I love his last page here, architectural revolution. If you don't take my architectural forms, then we will create a revolution to overturn you. Going forward another 40 years, we get to the high modernism, we have kind of the end of the road for that sort of process, although it's still sort of a continuation of it. High modernism form represents the functions of a modern society, so that if one designs a TWA terminal like Eero Saarinen did, one could use the form of a swooping bird about to take flight. And if one wanted to represent the corporate functions of modern society, one needed a very subdued sort of black box, as it were, in compliance with enough sophistication of materials that they fit well with the gray suits and the other expectations of office wear that you had at the time. So again, these were, you could look at Mies building and say this is an office building, and you could obviously look at Saarinen and say this is not an office building. Now, what happened in the mid-1960s, which is only a decade or so later, again, we have a breakdown of that system. We have kind of an overthrow of high modernism, if you were. And there were really two different currents that were stirring that would come to the fore in the 1960s and become prominent, very prominent over the next 3 decades. One is post-structuralist theory, which is a heavy form of rationalism, which sort of began to question meanings in and of themselves. And then we have the semiotic direction, which was also very prominent in the 60s, where again, one could define a building into symbols and indexes and the like. But once again, they both were representational systems. And if we carry this forward, say into the 1980s, we reach a very sort of interesting point, particularly under the guise of what was called architectural deconstruction. Not only did we firmly believe that architecture was visual language, but deconstruction sought to destabilize the presumed meanings underlying that language. So in fact, architecture in a way opened itself to a kind of a process of conceptual gamesmanship, whereas, as Peter Eisman did with the column on the left, you put a column in the building, but then you don't carry it down to the floor. So it has a symbolic expression of a column, but the syntax is wrong because it doesn't do the function. It's a grammatical error as far as what the idea of a column was. And I think this is where architecture really took the dead end turn, as it were, because you could only pursue such a model for a couple of years before it would become something of a very sort of boring exercise. And beside that, well, I'll make the argument this way. It's a reductive trap of theory because it presumes that architecture is simply a visual language, and that's important, belying the fact that people do not experience architecture in linguistic terms. Secondly, in limiting the architecture to a representational process, it reduces the design, in the case of deconstruction, to a purely conceptual exercise where you play off what the meaning of this strange object coming down from the ceiling is. But thirdly, and most importantly, it ignores the fact that the experience of architecture is a corporal one, a multisensory and emotional, hormonal, phenomenal one, grounded in the entire bodily organism. So the human experience arises in the nexus of the ecological, social, and physical environments that we live, and it is that level that we really should go to, or at least put a lot more attention toward, to understand how people really do respond to the built environments. So if you take the premise, as I would like to take, that if we're going to build a kind of an architectural way, a way of thinking about architecture in the 21st century, I think we have to begin to take some of the 21st century insights as sort of the basis for our deliberations, as it were. So let's fit it with this particular statement. I brought back Evan Thompson. So please, by the way, he's a philosopher who worked many years with Francisco Varela, who was a biologist. And they were both basically exploring the same issue of the human organism. Thompson was a phenomenologist and later began still as a Buddhist in a lot of his thinking. But in any case, I love this particular passage from his book, because the nervous system, the body, and the environment, they are structured dynamical systems, and dynamical is of course important, and they are coupled to each other on multiple levels. They are so enmeshed biologically, ecologically, and socially, and I would even throw in emotionally, that a better conception of the brain, body, and environment would be as mutually embedded systems within, rather than as internally and externally located with respect to one another. So again, I like the way that the tendency is to bring, you're not considering the body in isolation, but considering it within itself, within around itself, and we're going to see how it can be expanded at a social or cultural level as well. Two other principles I think are suggested by this relationship. One is that you cannot extract the organism from the environment in which it is embedded. And if you ever go to Mantua, you can see this wonderful mural by Giulio Romano. But the second point is that designers build environments, and therefore they create culture in a sense. And this is, I think, a very important point, because they create the medium in which our lives unfold and in which we either thrive or languish as organisms. So let me bring in one last aspect of this, which is this notion of niche construction, because I think it also sort of clarifies some of the points that I've just made. Niche construction began in the, well, I guess began in the late 80s, came to be fairly prominent area of population biology in the mid 1990s. And originally it was sort of a science that sort of looked at the way certain animals modify their environments, and then how these modifications in turn have some implications for how these organisms continue to evolve, as it were. And so it wouldn't take long, and I've going back to until we get to the book of niche construction by three Stanford professors, where the realization was there that, well, wait a minute, if a beaver has modified a stream, what have humans done? They've constructed a massively modified world of cars, farms, bridges, cities, and everything of the sort. So that this type of niche construction is likely to have been extremely consequential in terms of our own evolution. And Michael was so kind a couple of years ago to send me this paper by a couple of his students on triadic ecological, neuro, and cognitive niche construction, which is really a much better expansion of the concept beyond ecology to the fact that every time you develop a particular motor skill, for instance, you actually make changes to your cognitive powers of reasoning. I mean, a good example of that, it might be if you learn to play a piano at a certain age, you actually end up increasing your IQ by a point or two on tests. So that you can see here, we have a much better sort of mixture of the environment, the variables of the environment, as well as the systems within ourselves. But the key point to take away from this is that just as we build our environments, so do our environments design who we are and what we will become as human beings. We are, again, just designing the very culture in which we exist. And you can think of some of the implications for that when you look at social media and the like, the way that people spend a good part of their lives on that. I'm not moving too fast, am I?
No.
No.
All right. Well, let me go back. This is what when I began that book, I was trying to look at considering ways to how do we really begin to explore some of these issues. And again, this was kind of based on a little bit on a paper of Francisco Varela, that there are really three ways to consider the idea of architecture predicated on experience. One is the obvious one, the organismic or homeostatic regulation of the body within the built environment. We know we need certain temperatures to be comfortable to live and work in, that's obvious. And of course, those technologies have taken care of those issues long ago. But we have problems with environmental deprivation. We've have the notion of environmental enrichment, although it hasn't really been explored with human beings at this point. And then we have a kind of a body of evidence-based design that goes back to the 60s. And out of this, we've had a lot of interesting things. I think one of the most important of which is the notion of biophilic design. So that's one area where we're looking at sort of these horizontal qualities of the environment and how they impinge upon our own organism. But we can also turn to the organism itself, how we perceptually couple with a built environment. We're looking at basically all of our systems, of which there have been a lot of new research over the past 30 or so years. We have proprioceptive and kinesthetic systems, sensory motor and mirror systems. And of course, there's a new discovery, emotional, visceral, and hormonal systems. We're certainly understanding this much better. Visual, navigational, place mapping systems. Navigational place mapping systems are really quite accurate at this point and quite specific in terms of we know precisely how the brain is sort of working together in these parts of the brain. We have our traditional auditory and olfactory systems, which have been all together streamed out of contemporary architecture because nobody will open a window. Windows are not allowed to be open. So we lost the olfactory system to a large extent, and the same thing is true with the auditory. We can use microphones now. And then finally, and I think this is most important for architects, we have a perceptual attunement with form and space. Now, this is very different than discussions of form and space. If you go back, say, to the 1939 and Gideon's Space-Time and Architecture, we're not sort of devising theories of space and form. We're actually have a lot of evidence of how we as physiognomic organisms actually experience form and space. And then the third area, which I think is vitally important, if only because we've neglected it in architectural theory for at least a half a century, is the social basis of our cultural interactions. Now, here we run into problems because we're going to see a lot of failed social theory. If you look at architectural going back in time, architectural building. But we have new and updated evolutionary models of human development, which take us much far back in time. In fact, much further back than the human species. We have an interesting and very, very insightful understanding of how the social brain develops and how it doesn't develop. And this is something that is absolutely critical to a society where we have so many aberrant behaviors that lead to serious social problems. And we have this issue of ritualization and beauty, which I've just sort of put under the heading of a design ethos. And what I want to do is cover all three of these in turn, with putting, well, I think probably put most of the attention on the second and third parts of these approaches. So let's start with the homeostatic regulation, the body with built environment. And let's start with these two images, because this, again, I think vividly portrays the failure of architectural theory, a sociological theory as it was applied to architecture in the 1960s, although this particular apartment complex goes back to the 1950s. There was a concerted effort, I would say in the late 50s, to bring sociological and anthropological theory into design. And the premise was that if you could change an environment, you could tear down the slums and build a new modern environment according to the idea of what was modern, that you would have the image at the top, the glass view out to the grass lawn, the bicycles, the baby carriages, the people meeting by their mailboxes and kids in cribs and the like. And then you have the reality of Puerto, which was a slum outside of East St. Louis, where it turned out to be one of the greatest architectural disasters in the history of urban planning, or the Great Society programs. The top is how the architect envisioned his building to be used, and the latter is how it quickly came to be used before finally, for the third time, they gave up and dynamited the whole project to the ground. So the question is why did this happen, and why was this failure so traumatic, in the sense that for 50 years we've had an enormous amount of research associating impoverished environments with obesity, disease, depression, stress, crime, drug addiction, alcoholism, asocial behavior, psychological and personality disorders, and rates of morbidity. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of documents out there if you care to go and look at the research. And yet we have no programs, either locally or urban programs or national programs, that really have an answer to fix this problem. And again, the problem is not just an architectural one, but certainly architecture, when you create sort of grave mistakes the way the housing projects did in the 50s and 60s, certainly will play a role. And again, this goes back to the problem that so much of sociological theory at the time was so inadequate for the problems, which were, I think, relatively minor compared to the scale that they are today. Now, let's take the opposite point of view of environmental enrichment. Now, this is interesting because we have zero research on architectural enrichment, but we have, and of course, it's a difficult thing to research from the point of view of the lab, because you can't, obviously, for ethical reasons, you can't put people in poor environments and you know, and see how poorly the rate of brain growth development is. But we can do it with rodents, and it works very well. There is an optimal level of environmental stimulation, a little bit of a social life, a larger cage, and suddenly you see that brain cell developing to really twice or three times the size of the brain cell of the rat that had virtually no stimulation and no social connectivity. So, I mean, this seems to be pretty obvious. If this works with rats, it's certainly going to work with us, because we're not all that different in terms of the development of our brain, and how do we bring about these long-term enhancements of the hippocampal and memory networks, and begin to see how much the levels of anxiety we can drive down in social relationships that we can cultivate with more enriched environments. Now, again, and I'm not being critical because a lot of this information really isn't out there to the professional world. But I mean, architects don't really think of buildings in this way, or most architects, I should say, do not think of buildings in this way. And most designers, I mean, whatever the object, I think it's very much the same. Now, there are different levels of research, and there can be very simple levels of research. And I just go back to this 1984 paper by Roger Ulrich, who is still around, still doing research today. And all he did was go into a New York hospital and look at the rates of people who had gallbladder surgery, which at that time was about a 7-day operation, because they had to pretty much cut open your entire abdomen. And he looked at the recovery rates of two groups of rooms. One group of rooms had a view out to trees. The other group of rooms had a view out to a brick wall. And he correlated as carefully as he could the age and the sex and the the problems that were recorded both before and after surgery. And what he discovered is simply having a view of nature brought down that recovery time in the hospital by 1 day, but it also led to many fewer medications being asked for by the patient for pain, and there were many fewer complications related to the surgery of those who had a view of nature. Now, this is such a simple piece of research, and it's difficult to understand how dramatic its effect has been since 1984. It was really sort of published out there in the public realm by the 1990s as more and more research was coming together. But today, architects typically, if they're going to design hospitals, they bring in hospital specialists who are well versed in the fact that nature has to be part of the recovery process, and hospitals don't have to have the green walls and the like, which they had back in the 1960s. So simple research, a very sort of dramatic turn in architectural development. And I think if we can get into other areas, we're going to see some other turns as well. I just put this in because this is a sort of a recent series of papers that come out of Asian scientists. The idea of forest bathing, which is really just taking 2 or 3 days within a forest, and then they come back and they measure their blood pressure, their blood samples and the like. And when they discovered that just a couple of days in the forest, as it were, away from the city, enhances or elevates the white blood count in our bodies, which fight off diseases all the way down through heart diseases and the like. Now, this is something that we've known for a while, that obviously people talk about recharging their batteries. They want to go to the beach or they want to go to the mountains where they can live and be in a more natural situation, and of course people always respond of how refreshing it is to go and do that for a week or 2 or 3. But again, if this is true, then why don't we put more of those forest bathing activities within our cities, within our towns, closer to home, so we don't have to do it if you get that 2-week window every summer for a vacation. So this spawned the area, again, of biophilic design, which I think is really only at its beginning stages, because it's been looked at, obviously, from the point of view of adding more plant life and things like that to the city. But I've just been working on a project where I've gone far back in time, and it astounds me that for how long that notion of paradise was associated with gardens, and how preeminent the garden was in societies that had a relative state of calm and stability versus those that did not have the climate or the topography for a lot of vegetation. So again, that's just something I'll throw out. And again, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the work of Albright, where he's pointing out that we have particular delight in certain visual shapes and patterns, as he says, the strands of a cable bridge, etc. And the question is why? Well, I mean, there were there have been several discussions on that, that basically our eyes evolved in eye organs as it developed into human form for over millions of years. They were raised in natural climates and looked for natural patterns and the like. But, you know, again, it's something that would be interesting to pursue within an architectural or a design context, because just as Vitruvius would argue that we have to adjust a statue at the second level of a building, bring it forward slightly from the vertical so that it looks normal to the eyes. I mean, architects have always been aware of these optical corrections. And this is, again, it was something that could be implied with this type of research. Okay, so let me go. Are there any questions right now? Okay, so let me go to the second part of this, how the organism perceptually, aesthetically couples with the built environment. Now, I mentioned we have all these systems, and I don't have time to go through everything with the systems. So what I want to do is to frame this discussion around three ideas. One is the idea of perception, how we perceive, basically what we're learning about human perception and action. The second is mood, and the third is atmosphere. And I guess the second and third is somewhat related, but it's interesting because they really can be considered apart in design terms. So let's go with the idea of perception. And again, I think what we're coming to here is interesting, because we're not the first people really to hit upon how humans perceive. And I take us back to two doctoral dissertations, one of 1873 and one of 1886. Robert Fisher spoke about the fact he coined this term Formgefühl, which we'll get to in a moment, just means the feeling for form, the optical feeling for form, where he says our relationship with the object is at heart physiognomic and emotional. Now, this is very interesting, I think, for the architect. And interesting, if you follow this forward, there is a whole body of architectural theory that comes right up to about 1908, talking about the physiognomic and emotional responses of people within particular architectural environments. Now, what happened there was in part World War I, but also in part that the fact that we went to a more functionalist view of what design was with the advent of modernism. And we sort of lost this notion that there is a physiognomic and emotional part of our perceptual relationship with the world. Heinrich Wölfflin in 1886, in his dissertations, opened it with the question of how is it possible that architectural forms are able to express an emotional mood, an emotion or a mood. Now, Wölfflin, again, got somewhat sidetracked by art history theory, which talked about things of balance and symmetry and the like, but I think he was right on one point, that physical forms possess a body only because we ourselves possess a body. In other words, our body gives us already an intuitive understanding of that heavy rock, which might be over on the edge of a cliff, that it might indeed fall, because we know through our own gravity that if we were pushed out that far, we would likely fall sometime in the near future. So these three forms, these three terms, Formgefühl, Raumgefühl, and Einfühlung, were all prominent terms for about 30 years between 1873 and say 1908, 1910. And they can be translated as a feeling for form, feeling for space, and a feeling into, which is the term empathy. And I actually worked on translating those texts back in the early 90s, because there have been texts that no one else had explored at that time. And it was only then I went to a conference in British Columbia around, I don't know, probably around 2005, where I completely surprised by discovering there were several neuroscientists at the conference who were actually doing work on looking at on the brain of people, for instance, that don't have that capacity for empathy, what is missing, what is lacking within that particular system. So I was actually invited to the conference to talk about Robert Fisher, but at the same time, I felt completely out of place because the philosophers and the neuroscientists at the conference were already sort of miles ahead in thinking about these things than where I was at that point. Now, obviously, one of the elements that has really reformed our way of thinking about perception has been the discovery of mirror systems. And of course, Michael was very much a part of that in the 1990s. And we're really talking about something that is less than 30 years old that has already had a very dramatic effect in where biological and the perceptual sciences have gone. But we now know fairly well that when we view the actions and intentions and emotions of others, we activate certain brain regions that we would use in expressing that or in performing that action or understanding that intention or that emotion. And we do it without, of course, we do it in the sense that we're emulating what we see in our brains, but we don't necessarily have to. We listen to a piano, so we don't have to move our fingers in terms of playing the piano. We can do it. We can do it through the brain itself. So this process has been called mirror mechanisms. Has been called embodied simulation. And what this means for architecture, and it's very important, is that the space form is not Euclidean, it's not neutral. Everything has a value, and we simply have to do some study and understand what these values are for most people. There's been a lot of work taking these mirroring principles into the world of art, where again, with the activation of embodied mechanisms encompassing the simulation of actions, emotions. And, and again, this is, I mean, we know this to be true because we go into a museum and look at the slave of Michelangelo, and we know that we sort of tighten up our body as if we're somehow being trapped in stone because we're empathizing with what we see, in the same way that we can read passion in the movements of bodies. Now, are there implications of this for the built design? Yeah, well, yes, but we have yet to really begin to study this. There has been a fair amount of research revolving, as in this one particular paper of abstract art, static, meaningless images, and the role of embodied simulations and digestions and perception of works of art. So we know that, but if this is true with lines on a page, as it were, it would certainly be true with lines or forms of architecture. And if we go into the courtyard of St. John in the Lateran in Rome and see these twisted columns, I mean, do we not feel some sense of tightening or anxiety there that we would not see if all those columns were perfectly polished and straight? So I guess the next question is, how would we go about studying these sorts of things from an architectural perspective? Well, I think we can do it in the same way that we, in a sense, can study a painting or nature. If we go into a Japanese garden, we become immersed within the nature of the place. We become aware of the nuances of light, scale, color, texture, relation, depth, sound, layering, et cetera, the wonderful sound of the water, moving waterfall coming down. And And if this is true there, then it must be true in architecture as well. I mean, it's modulated by light, scale, color, texture, relation, materiality, movement, sound, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in a sense, we've already known this. I mean, not everybody can walk into and travel to Ravenna in order to experience this. I mean, it's something that we can experience at much smaller scales and much smaller level than at San Vitale. But the point is that we haven't really explored what is going on, and why we have these sorts of responses to particular environments. We could take a series of studies and just simply look at something as simple as texture. We can look at Alberti's Rucellai Palace in Florence with its very sort of thin, almost delicate textural covering, which you can see because the patron couldn't afford to build the entire palace. And so you can see where he had to stop the brickwork or the stonework. And you can walk up a few blocks and see the Medici Palace, where you have these blocks of stone that weigh several tons. And you have a very different sort of architectural impression. Well, one, we can intensely feel the weight and the gravity. The other has sort of a textile quality to it, almost a delicate film attached to a brick. And I've just put in two other examples because there's been a lot of studies over the years on ruins and how we find them so compelling, as it were, to explore, like the Maison Carré here. We're not just exploring history, but we're also exploring an environment that has a certain patina, a certain texture, a certain qualities that are just removed from what is new and what is modern. Therefore, in a way, they're somewhat appealing. You could take the old concept of a monastery, which Paulson did, and gave it a very sort of modern treatment, but at the same time, there's enough texture, even though all the surfaces are smooth. We have the visual texture of the stonework on the columns and the texture of the wood. It's an interesting sort of play of non-texture and texture, and keeping it at its most simple level. So that would be one way to begin to get into some of these variables. And with that, I want to pivot to the idea of mood, because again, this is something that is very, very rarely raised within architectural parlance. If you can look at all of the work of Vermeer, almost every painting, there's a window in it. And in almost every painting, there's a certain attraction to that window. Now, why is that window so appealing, and why is that attraction there? And this is not just with 17th century Dutch people, it's very much true with us today. We are attracted we tend to gravitate toward a window in a room. Well, Holland, of course, is a fairly sort of gloomy sky for a good part of the year in terms of cloud cover. And that, and historically, the architecture has been sort of very, very small windows. It's, it's sort of a textile manufacturing culture where there was some money, but for good housing, but again, I guess this was, but the glass became so important because you could open it to get the fresh air, you could open it to get whatever sunlight you got, and even if you were performing a task like pouring a glass of milk from a pitcher, obviously the closer to the window, the better light you have, and the easier that task becomes. So, but we're in a way, we're sort of like those insects that fly around lights on a patio at nighttime. We are almost always sort of attracted to light. And there has to be some sort of a basis for this, of why light, for the most part, is so appealing. And one could do the same thing with aromas, which Richard Neutra, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with his work out there, talked about. If you wanted to change a mood to a room, all you have to do is open it up to a garden to get that fragrance. And that's true. I mean, that's a very simple thing that we can do, but we of course have largely forgotten that we have a sense of smell in that regard. But what I do want to point out is that emotion is traditionally defined as a response of an organism to a stimulus, but that view is changing because it's considered, I think, it's beginning to view this as sort of an endogenous kinesthetic activity unto itself, a predisposed movement of the organism. When we go into that room and walk over to the window, we don't really think necessarily we're doing that. It's just something that we will do habitually or intuitively. So we're developing, I think, a much better sort of understanding of emotions in that sense. And of course, we know very much how they're tied to various parts of the brain now than we did 20 years ago. But I like some of these definitions of emotion. Sheets Johnson, their affective feelings and tactile kinetic feelings are experientially intertwined. Emotion is really connected with proprioception. It's a postural attitude, a corporate readiness to act in some way or another. And then Calambetti says that all living systems, sense-making systems, emotion pervades cognition through and through. So emotion is integral to both perception and action. And when you think of it, I mean, there's always a level of mood or affectivity there. It only changes when we see something we like or we don't like. And so emotion is not something mysterious sort of rising up from below, which we like to keep down from the traditional views of it. It is something that is always there. And if we develop a particular type of anger within an urban environment, it could be that urban environment is inducing somewhat those sorts of modal responses. And as I said, I was looking at some of these questions of mood, as it were. And I was very much interested in fact, I think I mentioned this to Michael in an email a month or so ago, but I was looking at Chartres Cathedral. And it's interesting because it's Notre Dame de la Chartres. It's a church of Our Lady. And interesting, there were almost no churches of Our Lady prior to the 11th century. They started dedicating churches. So there was this sort of cult of Marianism, the Virgin Mary, interest in her that sort of cropped up. It was very strong, and it sort of carries through a little bit into the early Renaissance in some really interesting ways. But you wonder why? Why did this come about? Well, it's kind of interesting because if you go to the west door of Chartres, you have Christ and the judgment, the last judgment figures there, and that's the oldest part of the church. It got into a fire, I think, in 1194, and had to be rebuilt over the next 30 years. But the last judgment is very harsh. I mean, basically, you get an up or down. You're going to go to heaven. You're going to go to hell, and that's it. These are your sins, and this is the result of where you should go. But Mary always sort of, I think the interest in Mary at the time was that the role she played as someone as an intercessor in our divine fate, as it were. That even though we're human, we make a lot of sins. Mary is someone, it seems, more hospitable to go to say, can we have some mercy? Can you intercede on our behalf so that we can go to heaven? So again, it's kind of interesting that you have this two sorts of parts of Christianity, that sort of earlier sort of harsh judgmental part, and then you have kind of a softening of Christianity with the sense that you could go to someone like Mary and find forgiveness. And of course, this is one of the original windows from the 12th century church before the fire that was moved to a new location. And this is only a very small part of the window. But you can see here again the aura that she conveys with that slight tilt of the head. And in fact, that was a change made not too many years ago because they discovered that they had more knowledge of what the original looked like. So this is apparently back more toward the original. And you have that shimmering blue that Viollet-le-Duc went crazy about, talking about how wonderful that was as a base color for these. And then, of course, you have that scarlet background that brings out the halo effect of the blues in both her gown and the halo itself. So you can see here, they're not only playing with mood, but of course, there's a whole theology behind this, that a church was really a transitional space between earth and heaven, and it effectively became the gateway to heaven. And you can see now, I mean, I hope, at least the way I view it, that it becomes a very interesting phenomenon that this notion of playing with light to this way became so prominent at a period like this, where of course they were developing these techniques for the first time since antiquity, and probably this glass work is better than what happened in antiquity. But I think this brings us to this notion of atmosphere, which is a more kind of embracive idea, the emotional perception of architecture. And, you know, again, I want to emphasize their pre-reflective, sensory motor, kinesthetic, polymodal, emotional articulations of a more pervasive mood. Now we know this, we go into a Turner gallery in England or somewhere else, and we know Turner right off the bat. And we know Venice. We know what it looks like. We know what it smells like. We know that, again, that light sort of patina, almost white patina that the city holds even today. So that the play of atmospheric effects is something that has a certain primal attraction, arousal, or even just a simple process of restoration and rest that can be associated with this. And of course, atmosphere only, I would say, the past 10 years is really has come into architectural thinking, and it's become very prominent. And I don't need to go through all these definitions, but I mean, if you look at something like Utzon's house in Mallorca, the simplicity of it, and yet it has a great sort of atmosphere to it, with a little shred of sunlight coming through an opening, where you have a room with a single round sofa, which already conveys the idea of communal activities with other people, social activities. You have the very sort of simple stonework of local stone. You have the great view, but of course it's sort of intensified by the particular depth that he shows. It's almost as if these walls were 9 feet thick. They're not 9 feet thick. He simply created this vista, this drama, with the perspective of those openings and what you would see from the sofa. So again, very simple means, but you have a very, 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 very unique sort of atmosphere, which is unusual. It doesn't depend on artificial lighting or artificial air conditioning or even sort of artificial finishes, even though it's right on the sea and you've got a lot of salt issues to deal with, which is another reason why not to have many of those other things. And you know, I got to Ordos Museum, which has sort of the same sort of contemplative effect, but I mean, all large spaces do this. When we come into an environment which is quite large and has a lot of, even though this doesn't have apparently a lot of visual detail to explore, just the size and the dimension really puts one into a somewhat contemplative mood where you want to sit there and try to take in things. You know, of course, the very simplicity of the material, where almost all of it is wood, and then of course you've got the metal for the enclosed parts of the museum. It's such a unique sort of statement in the emphasis that it puts on this sort of simplicity, but at the same time, this notion of grandeur, which is very strong within this. And we have many other examples of this, and probably the best one is, well, one of the better ones anyway, is the Berlin Philharmonic by Hall, which is just an extraordinary building. And you don't really understand it so much by photographs until you get inside of it and begin to see it. And the reason is that what he's done, and I'm not, he's suspended those ceilings large, they have sort of parabolic forms. And I'm not talking about the ones just over the orchestra itself, but rather the upper ceilings where we have the lights which kind of appear like stars. It's almost like you're in a very, very large tent. And by moving the stage into the center, you also have a situation where you have these tiered platforms stepping down, where almost everywhere you sit, you can focus on the orchestra, but you can also focus on the people behind the orchestra as they're focusing on the orchestra. So you have a sort of sense of communion here, all with at the same time the extraordinary acoustic experience of 102 instruments going with their drums and everything else. So it's really sort of the epitome of a sort of a multi-sensory, but also a highly sort of social atmosphere. If you go into a traditional auditorium with a stage at one end, a bunch of rows facing, you really don't have that social characteristic. So here's a simply altering the floor plan of a symphonic hall, and it changes entirely the character of that room. Now again, these are things that architects, I think a couple of centuries ago knew very well. Robert Adam, these are two rooms right next to one another in the Sion Palace. And one has almost a sense of tragedy of the dying slave and a little bit of Greek antiquity in the background. And the other is purely a room for festive activities. So here you simply change the moods depending on which room you go into. You can play with scales, and I've just taken the Piazza or the Church of St. Mark's in Venice, and play that off against a very small domicile by Patgal architects, where you have the same sort of feeling of forms and space, and yet here it's given over to the simple and very pleasurable act for many people, at least older people, of sitting down and reading a book, and not on the computer, to actually have hands. In any case, there's so, I mean, one doesn't have to have a commission for St. Mark's or St. Marco in order to come up with a very sort of clever experience design. Now I put this in, I think probably many of you have already heard or read about this paper, and I said, but if you haven't, again, I think it's an early experiment, and I think it has a lot to be done to build upon it and to expand upon it and consider it in different ways. But he took 10 architects and put them into an MRI, and then so I think it was 6 contemplative buildings, one being the Alhambra, the Court of the Lions in Granada, and the other sort of everyday pedestrian environments. And of course, he found very different sort of brain patterns. When we go into a shopping mall, we have the executive control and semiotic areas of the prefrontal cortex operating. We have to know what liquor land means and whether we want to go to Kohl's or the other place down the other end. And a contemplative environment is one where you actually, and again, this ties into, I think, very much with biophilic thought. You can create an environment where you don't have those sorts of executive commands or demands on your executive control areas, where you're dealing more with the emotions and the sensory motor and multisensory interactions. And this is something, obviously, I think we need much more of in the environments that we create, because we have such an imbalance of what is on the left versus what is on the right. I was speaking with someone just a few weeks ago, and we were talking about urban environments and how harsh it is to go out in a cold urban environment, northern urban environment, and walk the streets. And he was mentioning about the walkways of Minneapolis, which I'm familiar with because I did live there for several years. My first response, but no, they're just shopping malls. You're just walking over bridges in shopping malls, and it really is not that. I mean, it's nice you don't have to walk out into the 30 below zero gust of wind and air. But at the same time, I mean, who wants to walk by, you know, every store that can sell you almost anything you want to buy? All right, I think this is one last part of this this feeling for space. I just wanted to bring it in because, again, I think we're at the very beginning of where some of this research can be. This is an experiment done at the EPFL in Lausanne by Isabella Pasqualini. Primarily, Olaf Blanc was the lead neuroscientist Blanca was the lead neuroscientist on the project. And it was a very simple experiment where the woman you see is wearing a headpiece where she's getting the image of what is being recorded in the camera behind her. And the only variable of the experiment is that the walls, which are in the relatively narrow position here, expand out into a larger width. And she is supposed to assess her location with respect to the wall in front of her. And it's interesting because several things have happened here when she's looking at herself from behind, within the context, again, of perspective vision. That wall becomes much narrower. She seems to feel that she's closer to that end wall in that narrow condition. And conversely, if those walls expand, then she's farther away from it. But the most interesting part of this is that some people within the experiment actually felt the sensation of those walls touching their shoulders or their arms. So here's, I think, a pretty interesting kind of indication that space is full of these currents, as they were currents or patterns that we sense and relate in terms of where we are in relation to things and how we respond, particularly to things, and how a lot of studies have been done showing that pointed furniture, for instance, people avoid them or walk an extra few inches around them than usual because they don't want to stub their knee into or shin bone into a pointed object. So, you know, again, there's a lot to be done here, and we're really sort of only at the beginning. So I just put this in just for the anecdotal value of it. There's a Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, a nice little square that's always been regarded as a kind of a beautiful little Baroque facade with a palace behind it, or I'm sorry, a monastery behind it. But what's interesting about it is that, first of all, it's a very small square. And secondly, you have these juxtapositions. You can't really see it very well from this image, but you have this background of the monastery, which has a very curved form, like it's holding its open arms to receive you. And then you've got the reverse curve of the porch in front and the reverse curve of the facade in front. So you've got these sort of three different sort of dynamic kind of things coming together within a very small space. And again, the way this particular courtyard is, it's a good photograph because you're coming basically from shadow into light over most of the day. And so you have that sort of effect with light. The anecdote is that I used to show this image when I was teaching history, and I would be describing it. So a number of my students, when they went to Rome or other places, would tend to look at the buildings that we talked about and the like. And this one particular building, the student met a waitress at the little cafe here in front of it and fell in love, as he said. So there's an indication that architecture can actually have a pretty dramatic effect on one's life, which I think, you know, again, we seldom think in those terms, but it's just an anecdote. Parapersonal space, another area. This is a fair amount of research now on parapersonal space. I think it's kind of interesting. It's one of those areas where a lot of people are looking at it from different perspectives. But I mean, there's a reason St. Ambrose built his little cubby hole within the cathedral, and why children like to be in nicely scaled spaces where they have their immediate parapersonal space quite under their own control for a change. And of course, we respond very differently to objects within our reach or within near reach, as opposed to those objects that might be out of reach, 10 or 15 feet away. Certain objects would be dangerous up close, certain objects have no dangerous connotations when they're far away. They're not in our parapersonal space. And just one last thing, again, just from the interior of scale of Chartres Cathedral. Again, it makes everyone go here or go to the Pantheon. You just look at the people, they all walk in and do the same thing. They walk in tentatively about 15 or 20 steps and then stop. And then after just a few more minutes, they actually begin to walk around and explore a little bit more. All right, so let me go to the third area, which is a social basis of our cultural interactions. And again, this is an area that we've basically have forgotten about, going back to, and I think a lot of it was the sort of failure of all the research that was done in the 60s from psychologists, anthropologists, and sociologists. So what can we learn here? Well, again, if anything, I think we can learn our context a little better, because if you go back to 1960s, 1970s, they talked of human cognitive development, which was only around 50,000 years. That was supposedly when humans, maybe humans existed, the Homo sapiens existed prior to that, but they really didn't become human until around 50,000 years ago. And of course, every architectural textbook talks about the primitive hut, and Vitruvius talks about it. He finds it in these shores around the Mediterranean. But of course, even this is not a human invention, because if you go to Terre Haute, France, which is Nice, by the way, very nice place to go, there's a museum which was built on this site, and they reconstructed these huts that they found dating for almost as far away as 400,000 years ago. And the interesting thing, this is not Homo sapiens, but this is Homo heidelbergensis. In other words, it's another prior species, probably the species from which we evolved. So we weren't that clever to invent everything. And if we put up a time chart, I have put up this time chart a year ago. Homo sapiens would only be 200,000 years old, and now they've added about 100,000 years onto it. But the interesting part of it is the other end of the spectrum, the 2 million year old Homo erectus, where they were already developing certain skills and qualities and cognitive processes, which is going to go through this evolution of 2 million years. Now, again, this Homo heidelbergensis, 50% brain increase, and had communal hearth, and capacity for mentalizing, and almost surely engaged in forms of music, dancing, and song. So I guess at least that tells us we weren't all that clever in what we've done, but of course, cognitive skills build upon cognitive skills, so we have a much faster rate of development in this regard. We used to think, if you go back to archaeology textbooks of the 1970s, that evolution had all to do with the evolution of hand axes. It was technology that really demonstrated the cognitive skills of the brain. And now the focus is turned to the fact that it really is the social complexity of who we are that has been the driving force in both enlarging the brain, and of course right now the brain is actually shrinking somewhat because of, again, the the cultural environments within which we live. We know now that after 14 weeks after gestation, twins will reach out and play with one another. So there's a social impulse right there. There are experiments like Meltzor's experiment from 1983, where it was an incredible experiment where they went into babies, infants, just an hour or two old, made faces, and it would find that the infants could respond to those faces with their own faces. So why would this be the case? Because they were just born. They obviously have no sense that they have faces, or virtually no cognitive skills at all in that regard. But now we know, again, these are just mirror systems. And it's interesting to compare Maslow's kind of explanation of why this happened back in '83 with his revised paper, which was published in 2013. All right, so this is the, we're not going to be able to dramatically change human behavior anymore. We're going to dramatically change the architectural environment. New York's going to continue to build its skyscrapers until the whole city collapses. But I think what we have to understand is that our sociality and collective rituals are really very sort of fundamental expressions of our existence. And I brought in this little passage by Jack Panksepp and Colin Trevarthen, one being a psychologist, the other kind of a neurobiologist. It's a little complex, but I just wanted to try to explain it in just as few words as I can. That we know, again, from mirror systems, that we have a wonderful capacity to read the intentions and the emotions and the thoughts of other people with whom we come into contact. Now, how did we get this capacity to do it? Well, this is their explanation, that these other within self intersubjective representations, in other words, we're taking people within ourselves and we may even mimic the smile, whatever we have to do. We know what that smile means is that they are happy. And we have these sort of intersubjective contagions, as they call it, and they're spawned by affective systems, emotional systems much lower in the neocortex. But the point is that these neocortical processes, in their view, they're epigenetically programmed by experience. If we don't develop a sense of commonality, a social sense of wanting to belong and feeling that we belong at a very early age, it's very difficult to develop that at a later point in time. And of course, sort of the interesting, terrifying experiments that were done, a lot of them have been done with pup rats, where they'll take a young pup away from the mother and they beginning to see how quickly and how dramatically the entire metabolism becomes upset by that. And if you do that for a period of time, that metabolism never fully recovers. We had a very good example of that with the Romania a few years ago after the wall came down, as it were, because they had a series of places where children were encouraged to have, parents were encouraged to have children, and yet they didn't have the means to support them. So they had the orphanages, the state orphanages, to pick up hundreds of thousands of children, which were the most terrible orphanages probably ever created in the 20th century. And almost every child came out of that with very severe scars, if not severe forms of neuroses or other mental ailments. We have yet to learn that. and we see every day people going into mosques or temples or churches and shooting other people. You can only do that if you have no sense of feeling for people. And I think we have a pretty good idea of exactly when these windows are and how these time frames work. And again, this is not so much something that an architect can accomplish. We're not going to go back and recreate Pergamon, for instance, where we have a single sort of multicultural society. But we can begin to look back to see how these other societies on many levels have been so very successful over the years, and where you don't have this sort of intense violence, as it were. Um, uh, I mean, there are certain lessons here that that architects often have within their power to incorporate, say, within an urban scheme, but never give it the consideration to do it. Now, what I mean by this, again, it takes more than one architect to create a plaza, a piazza, or the like. But at the same time, we don't really begin, as the planners of our cities, don't really give much credence to this sort of thing. And I think we've, as a society, again, it has a heavy burden that we don't allow these sorts of festivals or festivities to take place, which really bring people together, draw people together, people that may have arguments or anger toward other people, they'll let them drop for a day, and then sometimes they'll let them drop even longer with more types of social experiences. So again, this is something I think we can do a lot of research on, and I think certainly as architects and planners and designers on every level, we should be giving much greater thought to this. This is an experiment by Colin Ellard, who is a psychologist, a Canadian psychologist. And he did a very simple experiment, had people walking two streets. One, this one in front of us with just a bunch of windows that have no sort of life connected to them. And the other was a street with a lot of small shop stores, streetwears, and people. Now, we know for many years that when someone walks past a stupid facade like this, they walk faster because they want to get away from it. And Colin's experiment demonstrated that they were simply bored. They had levels of stress and anxiety the longer they were in front of this particular building. And at the same time, those levels go down quite quickly if you could turn the corner and go down the street where you have a lot of what is often called street life and the like. Again, we seldom, we think at this scale, we seldom think of that scale of the street that has the street life. And it reminded me of something that Edward T. Hall, wonderful anthropologist from the 50s and 60s, did, where he raised this problem of tactile space. And he was using it as a critique of modernism. He says the failure of modern and industrial architecture was its lack of scale and tactile stimulation. Now that's really, I think, an interesting point, tactile stimulation. And he goes on to talk about we have no capacity to, no opportunity to build a kinesthetic repertoire of spatial experiences. So if you were asked two people, which of these two streets would you rather walk down? Everyone would pick the little alley in Siena. And I don't think anybody other than Daniel Libeskind would pick his building in Las Vegas. Because again, what you see on the right is the architecture as the object with no concern to how people walk by it on the outside, and it happens to be a shopping mall, so there's very little concern for how they walk by on the inside as well. But the point is, one is a star architect who, Siena was built by the everyday person with a few sort of guidelines in terms of the city of where the streets should be and how tall the building should be, and the materials were given. So with that, I'll just raise the issue of affordance, which again has some backing going back to Uexküll, a biologist, and Gibson, a psychologist. And we'll go back to the same situation we just saw with the other glass box. Which street would you rather walk down or ride down? I mean, you certainly, nobody in their right mind would want to walk past the building on the left and yet everyone would be fairly happy. This is just happens to be a part of a campus at Stanford, and I'm not talking about the architecture in and of itself, but again, that sort of tactile quality of the space, but also the fact that it offers us affordances. It offers us the ability to ride a bicycle or to walk or to see people, to meet people. So we have this sort of social realm. The campus is a pretty good social environment. It's not hard to walk up to people your age and start a conversation. Whereas the city that you see on the left, it's absolutely impossible, and you wouldn't want to do it anyway because you have no idea who that person is. But my point is that we have to think more about our sensory and emotional and social engagement as we get into this. And the problem is, and this is with every sort of design studio I go into, I don't go into them very much anymore, but I used to, all architectural students tend to think of the building on the left as architecture. No one thinks of architecture as that street that you see on the right. Now, of course, it was a road at one time, but it could be a nice, it could have always been, also been designed that way in the beginning. But that's my point. We don't think about the sensory and emotional aspects of it. We're focused entirely on the building and its technology in many cases. And there's probably been no worse invention in the history of architecture than the mirrored glass wall. Which brings me to the last issue, which I want to raise, which is the idea of beauty. And again, you see that from the typical sort of judgmental point of view, from the social perspective. And I like this little quotation of Roger Scruton. To environmental degradation or bad design is a form of moral degradation, treating people as impersonal objects instead of living organisms to be respected. His is a critique of modernism. In fact, his first critique was a book on architecture, I think going back to about 1974. And he's always been an interesting critic. He would I'm sure like to be back in 18th century Georgia and London, but that's fine because he's got that sensitivity and for that scale and the sort of tactile qualities of those environments. The other book is a new one, and Narvaez is a psychologist at the University of Notre Dame, where she argues that beauty may have a neurobiological basis, that we have the sort of shared ethos for beauty in our world, and that this is really should be an important ethical or moral part of the profession of designers, is to create something. Now, again, this is in response to a very pervasive attitude of designers going back to, say, deconstruction, where something had to be edgy, something had to be off, something had to be cool to sort of sit around and think, well, why did the person do that? We don't really have to sort of take an antagonistic sort of point of view when we're looking at creating something that's going to be out there for a number of years. We can simply put it into the perspective of what are we looking at the people that we're doing this for, or are we looking at something that Architectural Digest will publish in the next issue. So with this, again, we have this idea of social culture. We already have the idea of rituals already involved, where we have certain expectations of human actions and how others can participate. And I'm sure everyone's been to a string quartet or something where you see them peeking at each other to keep the music in unison. But also there's so many other levels where this works: the craftsmanship of the violins, the violas, and the cellos, the posture of the people, the fact that they wear the darkened clothing to put the emphasis on the sound and take it away from the visual appearance of it, other than the movement itself, which is quite striking as a visual phenomenon. again, I don't think we put enough effort into thinking how simple life can be, and yet how rich it can be with the same means that we have. We don't have to really go out and change the world entirely. Although I will make one editorial comment just in relation to, say the Piazza San Marco, the Church of San Marco. It works because it has all those things like memories and moments of history and the like. But bigness as an architectural concept today, I don't think I've ever seen a truly successful realization of it. The bigger something becomes, almost always the worse it is. And after a couple of years, it even gets worse beyond that point. You look at some of the EU complexes in Europe to see how poorly that was understood just 10 or 15 years ago. In any case, I don't want to editorialize. I just want to point out the dinner on the right that if you're going to design a house, maybe you should start with where that plaza is, where they can take out a table and have an outdoor meal and socialize. And that really is, in many respects, far more important than all the other variables that might go into designing a house. So I think that's it, right? I'm going to leave it up.
Shall we go to questions? Can you see the room?
Okay, I've got it bigger on my screen now.
Can you hear us well?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Harry. I have a question about design education for you. When our friend Juhani Palazma visited New School last time, he spoke about the need to expand design education to include courses in music, literature, poetry, philosophy, to nurture a certain cultural sensitivity in future designers. And I think your lecture today also implies the need for significant changes to the education of architects and designers. Would you agree? And could you just talk about the most important steps that you see in that regard?
Well, you know, I think Juhani feels, I think, you know, somewhere in many respects, I feel somewhere, I guess you should say, to many respects of how he feels. You know, architectural education, it starts at year one with the studio and ends in year 5 or 6 with the studio. And almost nothing works around that because that studio is going to consume at least 10 to 12 hours a day of the student's time. I mean, that is flatly wrong. You know, he's from a generation not too distant from mine, but when I went through the undergraduate program, in fact, we were required to get a 4-year degree prior to going into the master's architectural program. And I was very happy with that because I could take philosophy and all that sociology, which turned out to be not so good. But I was able to, I first learned to play a piano in college. I just took a piano lesson with a teacher. We just don't have those things anymore. People cannot sit back and really think, which he talks about philosophy. It's extremely important. They talk about the arts. They're extremely important because this is what the people we're supposed to be designing for, where this stuff can be successful. Now, I would like to also, I think in addition to the fact that the design studios are way too keyed on coming up with the concept of a design, I would like to see a significant part of that design studio devoted to research. And then that would free up also some hours for some serious coursework in other fields of the arts and humanities. Now, again, this is difficult today. The colleges and universities, the quality of those departments is dropping pretty dramatically, except in some of the elite universities. But at the same time, I mean, it's got to be something that the student also has to really, that responsibility they have to take upon themselves. It is important. We have to have the perspective. We're not technicians. and architecture itself is not technology. There's enough, the field is diversified with engineers of every kind and building contractors who can build almost anything. From the actual getting a product built is not the difficult part and should not really consume so much of the architect's time. But of course, I'm still saying that there has to be that drive, that ethical drive toward beauty and sociality involved with it. So yeah, I mean, I could not agree more with the idea that we need more music. And of course, I know. How is your son doing? If you don't mind if I ask the person?
He's doing very well. He's still playing piano.
He's still good. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a perfect example. I mean, you have that sort of cultural background, and how many students come into a university with that background? Very, very few. And usually they're from different cultures. They're often from different parts of the world. So yeah, it is. I think it's vitally important.
Thank you.
We were just talking about the different cultures, and architecture nowadays faces that a lot of architects have to design spaces at different places where they don't even know their culture. Can you maybe say some words on this globalization and interconnectivity of the different cultures happening right now and the difficulties for architects?
Well, what I will say, I mean, globalization has not worked out well in the sense that every major city wants to emulate. Let's take the 50 new cities that China has built over the last 25 years. Virtually every city is made really to emulate the international metropolis, whether it be Hong Kong or London or New York and the like. What I'm talking about, I mean, these sorts of qualities of cultural qualities are really kind of universal. They're not unique or particular to a single culture. Every culture has them. Some cultures express them much better than others. And I think one of the failing of our own culture in the United States is so many people, really do not have that sort of cultural sensitivity, which is not necessarily multicultural. It's just a sense that everybody knows that everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to be part of a group. Everyone wants to be accepted. Nobody wants to be bullied. Nobody wants to be harassed by the government or this or that. I mean, these qualities are the same. They're universal qualities. And the point is that we just tend, again, I don't want to try to sound critical of American society because I'm not, but I'm saying that we've sort of evolved in, at least with the United States, is a very sort of mercantile sort of culture where the important stress was put on the growth and production of goods. And that could be a great thing, because then you have more people with money, you have more people who can go out and take the piano lessons and read the books and things like that. So I don't know, I guess I'm sort of talking in circles right now. It's really hard to look at culture in the old sense and then try to, because I try to look at culture in a different way, like every environment that we are in is a culture. And whether it's successful or not is, I think, is sort of the rod that we should take to measure the success of what we design.
I've got a question, Harry. You used the phrase or said at one point something about the perceptual attunement with form and space, something that we need to have. When I was starting out in architecture school long ago, from time to time we would talk about Gestalt. Is this the same thing? Should I dust those books off?
I've always had kind of a sympathy for the Gestalt people because there is a lot to that. I mean, You know, I thought it was interesting. A friend of mine who I spent a year with at the Getty, I won't even mention his name, but he wrote a very critical column when Rudolf Arnheim published his book on the dynamics of architectural form. Arnheim was coming out of that tradition that goes back to Wolflin. And there is a lot there to Arnheim that is, you know, good, solid observation. And in some cases, I mean, he has the research as well. But I think I've always, I've used this as an example, and probably in the book, the last book I've wrote before this on embodiment, that you have the same sort of phenomenon at the Bauhaus, but only in certain areas of the Bauhaus where you had those people who were sort of informed about that sort of German aesthetic theory relating to form and space. And then, of course, you had the technicians, Hannes Meyer and others at the Bauhaus as well. But yes, I mean, you know, all those insights are always, I mean, again, you can separate what is false from what is true, but you can go back and read Kuhler and Arnheim and others and say, yeah, there is a lot there. And yes, I mean, we should be thinking of architecture in these terms. Some of the things Arnheim says, where he relates the two, well, I don't want to get into that, but he does, I think, in a few places oversimplify. But at the same time, his experiments could actually be done today. The same experiments could be done today with more sophisticated technologies, which I think would bring out a lot more would elevate their importance, because we'd have some basis to see what he was doing. There have been a few people that I haven't liked who have done this sort of research. There's a Canadian neuroscientist who was tried to argue that he did an experiment where he had people in MRI machines looking at curved environments and looking at rectilinear environments, and felt that people liked the curved over the rectilinear. I don't think we can ever get that sort of simplistic and make those sorts of generalizations, because there's too many other variables involved. But we do have to, you know, at least understand that everything that we see, we in many ways sort of reach out and touch and feel, or at least do it within our systems of embodied simulation. So we do something that's very scratchy, that would bruise a knee, is not something you would put in a walkway where you had the exposure to the knee, whereas if it was 50 feet in the air, it may have a very different sensation, because it's no longer within that sort of personal space envelope, as it were. So I don't know if I've answered that, but yeah, I do like the Gestalt psychologists.
Hi, Harry. I'm Chris. First of all, I want to thank you very much for your translations of Semper and Fisher's work. I relied much on your text on those, their still and empathy-informed text. I think it's listening to your lecture and listening to looking at the examples that you show. There are generalities that I feel that are being presented. First of all, when you say that you believe culture is everywhere, that I think is a very interesting statement. And I think what shapes us, how we behave in our environment so much, especially today after 2004 or 6, is this technology of our computer technologies that are changing our habitations. But most of us are working or living in an environment because our workload, our technology connecting us to our everyday actions, it does impact how we live in our environments. I think the postmodern, I also read your text, and I think the postmodern, it almost sounds like it's a denigration of postmodern theory, but postmodern, as you're mentioning, is quite expansive. It's many decades of discussions from image to, in a way, non-image, non-representational towards the end. And I think the questions that I have oftentimes when I listen to these general comparisons is, from which perspective are you speaking? From the perspective of the architect, theorist, reader of architecture, architecture, designer, drawer of architecture, architecture, builder, the master construction builder of architecture, along with the practitioners that has the entire, let's say, ecology of how architecture is made, which is not the architect, but there's the practice and there's the client and the developers and all of that. And then the user, the people who experience architecture. I think all of these 5 different groups of people will examine architecture in different perspectives. And it's very, I feel like sometimes the conversation of architecture and science interweaves these groups of people in a not so clear way, but shifts between the architect designer to architect producer to user experiencer. I wonder if you can speak about that a bit more. Or if that's unclear, I could ask another question. Because I think there's a very important thing to distinguish. Talked about the look good idea of buildings, that we're creating buildings of objects. So Peter Eisman will use certain theoretical or philosophical treatises to help him design his architecture. Whether or not we know Peter Eisman's thinking, let's say most people don't know architecture, they just experience it from their direct relationship with it. The form, as you say, if you're looking at an angle, certain angles have an impact on how we look at it. The forms do have an effect on our emotions, our experience, and our space around it. So are we, when you are in some ways critiquing some of the, in this particular text that we got, it was specifically Derrida and Deleuze that you mentioned, when you're critiquing certain groups of thinkers, are you critiquing their theory? Are you critiquing the, I feel like you're critiquing the process of architectural thinking, less so than the output. Because,
Let him speak.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was clear.
Let's take the case of the Eisenman Ohio State building, because I was in Los Angeles when Eisenman was designing it, and he was at the Getty fairly often. I never spoke to him directly about it or anything. That building is, I mean, first of all, and this is, Kurt Foster was the director of the Getty at that time, and we were very close, the two of us. But that building, we took opposite views of it. Kurt Foster, in fact, wrote a review of it for some magazine, I think, which was praising it. But I thought at the time, that theoretically it made no sense what he was doing. Now, there is this sense of novelty when you create something that's quite different and people, are attracted to it for a while. But what happens when that novelty wears off, where that becomes, last year's novelty? And this has happened so much in the world. And there's another issue related to that, which is this problem of the so-called star architects, where a campus president absolutely feels an obsession with building something and has to bring in a star architect to do it, to show that he's aware, culturally aware, what he should be aware. Well, that's in part what happened with the Eisenman building. He was brought in because he was the most recent star architect. I forget the time it was built, probably the mid 1980s. But as it turns out, the building very quickly sort of disassembled itself. It had a series of multiple events of design failure from the purely sort of tectonic point of view. And then they had a question of whether they were going to, just a few years ago, whether they were going to tear it down or spend another $50 million to try to repair the building. So yeah, I think, I usually do not go out of my way to criticize buildings because first of all, it doesn't do much to say. In fact, I'll even thought about not putting those images in from postmodernism or post-structuralism, but I felt I had to show something. But that's not my objective because I don't think Eisenman's ever given a single thought to a person, how a person would. In fact, he did the house, remember house, whatever it was, 5 or 6 or 7 that had the hole in the floor between the 2 single beds for the married couple. I mean, that was a clever joke, but it just doesn't work. And that's all it was a joke. And it was really literally a cardboard house. That too had all sorts of problems. And of course, he faced a lot of lawsuits with it. So let me just say, I'm not going after Peter Eisenman. What I'm saying is that when you think that way, when you think that architecture is some sort of an intellectual gain, or that you have to have something that is a little bit different than what was done last year, but not so outrageous it can't be built, then you're on a very sort of dangerous path because you're not thinking again about how people have to walk through or experience that building, and this is the reason I'm emphasizing it is because no one else has really emphasized it. Every design studio I walk into where I sit on a jury, all they talk about is the building, the building, the building. And of course, that's after they spend half the semester talking about, well, what's the idea? And then when the student finally comes up with the idea, he or she can do no more than put a little glass facade on the building because there's no time to do any detailing or give some thought to any other solution. So as far as I'm concerned, I mean, that's an entire wasted, 3 months of studio. And that's why I would like to see the studio sort of radically change, where you have some time for some reading and going back to Tatiana's question. I mean, Frampton used to bring in Heidegger for reading to all the studios. I wouldn't necessarily bring in Heidegger, but I would certainly bring in some people who would be thoughtful and perhaps a little more relevant to thinking about how people respond. And of course, Plasma does it very well with the people that he continually talks about. They're all interesting from the perspective of design. But no, I mean, I was a practicing architect for close to a decade. And the only reason I went out to the Getty, I just opened in an office in the early 80s, and I went out to the Getty because it was just a fluke accident. I ran into Kurt Foster, and he was intrigued by somebody living in Minnesota could be working on Semper. And I just ended up going that route after I got to the point where it would be very hard to get back into practice because of the way that materials and the practice itself changes so rapidly. All I'm asking is that I'm not asking that we put no consideration on the object as it was, but we put a lot more emphasis on thinking about, again, how what is the experience? Does it advance us socially or individually, or does it create an environment that really does what it should do? If it's a library, I mean, does it have a glary surface on the table? I mean, architects will think about that, but they won't think about, where you go outside of, say, the Getty History of Research Center for the History of Art, because there's no place to go outside and eat. And although eventually they did build a little cafeteria outside. And that cafeteria should have been a focal point of the complex, but the architecture was the focal point. And I might say the architecture, which costs so many hundreds of millions of dollars, destroyed at virtually every program that we had at the Research Center for the History of Art. For years, they didn't have the money they stopped all the programs. They didn't have the money to continue them, and that's what happened with that publication program. So there's ethical values there that were not taken into account. I mean, basically you had an architect with an unlimited budget, who was going to perform had to perform up to a certain level because he was the star architect brought in by the Board of Trustees of the Getty Museum.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
I'm trying to get my head around the difference between symbolism and atmosphere. Could you address that for me? In other words, if we go to the show, on the one hand, there's this symbolism that you gave us of Mary, the interceding, and on the other hand, there's what you might call the atmosphere of a worshipful atmosphere. So are these just two faces of the same thing, or
well, I mean, yeah, but not necessarily. One could do an abstract work of art with no symbolism, but would I mean, a lot of artists have just simply done it for atmospheric effects. I brought in the Virgin Mary because she was really sort of a. It was just something I'd worked on relatively recently, and it was interesting to me that a persona would suddenly assume such prominence. And yes, I mean, she was symbolic in a theological sense of being a savior, the Madonna. But at the same time, when you look at that frame, that window, I mean, it's an extraordinary atmosphere where you don't even have to be aware. In fact, she's so high up, you can barely see it. You can see her much better in the slide than you can in reality. But I mean, what they were doing at Chartres was that they actually had a technological innovation where they put in a double supports on the outside, flying buttresses. And then they took out a whole story on the inside so that you had effectively the two-story walls for windows up above the side aisles. And it let in about, I would say, at least 50, 100% more light than what was there previously. But they didn't want the white light because it would have been, you would have had direct sunlight in the light. So when you bring in colored glass, it has that effect of creating, you can see on every surface inside Chartres Cathedral, you can see a certain coloration which is cast by the light depending on where that sun is. So yes, I mean, Chartres has that atmosphere independent of the iconography of the Virgin Mary. But at the same time, if you can combine the two, it's even more interesting. I mean, I don't mind symbolism at all. I think can be a very important part of architecture, but I don't think it should be the sole purpose is to provide a story that someone has to interpret what is in it in order to understand what the architect or designer did.
Thank you.
Well, Harry, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. We're out of time.
Okay, well, I thank you very much for having me. I'm sure it's been a long afternoon. I'm just immersed in my own screen, so I don't have to sit through it.